Okay, hello again on the Tuesday, 30th of August, where nearly 2 months on, or more than 2 months on from the referendum on the 23rd of June, things look different, and yet things also look very uncertain. And so as a result, what we're going to try and do today with Emily alongside me,
hello,
is try and unpack in this question and answer session some of the different ideas, the different situations, and even in a certain sense philosophies for where the United Kingdom and its different constituent parts sits after this result on the 23rd of June then. That obviously was a result that went against David Cameron and his government, and which has had lots of ramifications thereafter. So in particular, what we've set out to do then is cover 3 different angles. What we already know, what isn't clear yet, and also, again, as much as is actually possible, what we can expect in the coming 18 months. So Emily, do you want to give us a broad overview of how we've come to these 3 different, in a sense, criteria?
So what I was most interested in for the 6 weeks after the referendum result, when I was putting together this PowerPoint, was thinking, well, actually, a lot of the issues that we were discussing in prior webinars and prior Q&A sessions have actually played themselves out already. So there are a number of things that we do know. We know how the referendum result had an impact on the incumbent government at the time. We know who resigned. We know who got jobs out of it. But there's also a number of things that are absolutely not clear yet. For example, most basically, if and when Article 50 will be triggered. So then there was this idea of, are there a number of things that we can perhaps expect or anticipate in the next 18 months? What might we see? What trends are being predicted? And what might actually be off the table? So those are the 3 things I thought people ought to know 2 months on.
And that's a lot to cover, but at the same time, I think it's absolutely essential that we try our best to clarify all of those different elements, which actually eventually are all interlinked, I would say. And if you think about a nice starting point is an overview geographically then of how the actual vote went. Sorry, I'm not sure if everyone is going to be able to hear at the moment, but in any case, what we see is clear sense of a divided country, which is something we actually covered in the actual course prior to the 23rd of June when we talked about a divided country. Well, we have had the confirmation of just how polarized the country was on this particular issue. And that reflects the fact that the actual opinion polls always showed a steady, concentrated block in favor of both sides. There wasn't much to be gained at the margins from either, and that's why it's not a surprise then that the vote was tight, and that it went then 48% Remain, 52% Leave. And you see a geographical spread of, in yellow, where the Remain vote is concentrated, and in the blue, what you see is the constituencies, or rather the council areas, where there was a majority in favour of Leave. And what we see there is a real difference between obviously Scotland and Northern Ireland that have a majority for Leave, for Remain rather, compared with a very widespread Leave vote across England and Wales. And that's again something that in the opinion polls we already had a fairly good indication of. The bigger surprise then is how many people then in England eventually swung it for the Leave campaign, and they're 52%. And of course, what we also know, as Emily was suggesting, is that the political ramifications, many of which were actually immediate. Oh, we've just got a question in the chat box. And Emily, do you want to comment on this question by R about the accuracy of that map?
To the extent that it represents local authority areas mapped onto constituencies, it's as accurate as we have it is possible to get a smaller, more grained analysis where you'll see that actually, you know, Scotland by and large still had a large proportion of people who voted to leave. So you can see that in greater detail. That's easy to find online. Yeah, so the idea is that it depends on the level of aggregation. So this is the one that was used in the BBC, and it's the one that we like to use for contrasting purposes. But it's true, absolutely, that ultimately a great deal of people in the north and in Northern Ireland voted to leave as well. That's right. So there's a couple of constituencies in Northern Ireland as well that should be blue, and I don't know why they're not showing up. But
yes, one can think actually that coverage sometimes in Northern Ireland is actually not so successful and detailed. So that might be a genuine issue there with the representations from this BBC website article. So that's something to bear in mind in that context. But if we think then about what it actually meant for day-to-day politics in the immediate aftermath of this result, well, David Cameron had said that he would stick around come what may, and of course from 10 o'clock in the morning on the 24th of June, he was gone and was going, the movers were in at 10 Downing Street and he was off to Buckingham Palace to inform the Queen of his decision. And after that, we had what was to be expected once David Cameron gave way, was a leadership contest, which in the end wasn't really a leadership contest. It was the last person standing, Theresa May, amongst the Conservative Parliamentary Party. And as is her prerogative, she then implemented a number of changes in her cabinet to the extent that certain Remainers, as it were put to one side, and in came a number of different appointments who had, in particular in the case of Boris Johnson and David Davis, a clear anti-EU, that is, Brexit mandate. And that's why we see then Boris Johnson appointed as Foreign Secretary. And David Davis then has a tailor-made position as Secretary of State for Brexit, although that is in essence a work in progress, as there weren't, to the chagrin of many people who voted leave, there weren't any measures and planning put in place by the Cabinet, it seems, or Whitehall to actually start the ball rolling on Brexit. So that's all being done now from scratch, in particular coordinated from Downing Street. The other interesting things to reflect on are the fact that there have been party ramifications, not just in the Conservative Party. What we've also seen is that Labour, which is a party that was nominally united in favour of a vote to remain in the EU, actually erupted into what probably can best be described as internal civil war, as there is now a leadership context in which actually the EU issue is playing a central role, with the challenge to Jeremy Corbyn, who is the current leader, by Owen Smith, basically being held on a platform, amongst other things, about wanting to reverse the decision for the UK to leave the EU. So in that context, there is something really interesting going on with Labour, and you could also add into the equation, although we haven't on this slide, the fact that UKIP, having had in a sense this enormous breakthrough in terms of putting the referendum to leave the EU on the agenda and then helping to actually create the momentum to win that vote, UKIP now is again pretty much in a state of disarray with a leadership context and the resignation of Nigel Farage. So there have been lots of political ramifications on that basis. But as we might expect in such circumstances, what happens now is very much uncertain. And so that certainty is, and this is Emily's wording here, is perhaps the first casualty then of Brexit. So perhaps you might want to expand on what you mean by that.
Sure. So one of the things that I found particularly interesting when we were doing the previous Q&As was that we were definitely sure of a number of things. We felt pretty comfortable about a number of things. And actually they didn't play out the way that we necessarily thought they would. And what's most interesting in particular is how some of the politicians that were on one side or the other that had definitive answers about things actually seem to be a little unsure about what it is they're supposed to be doing next.
And so here are, in a sense, the spin-off issues that come from such uncertainty. And in particular, the overarching question, the question mark that the United Kingdom now, in a sense, has after its initials, is the kind of settlement that it can aspire to when it comes to what to do in particular about trade. Trade with the EU, trade also outside the EU, because of the importance of the economy in this regard. And as a result, here we have a lot of uncertainty amongst the politicians who are now charged by Theresa May to actually conduct negotiations for such a settlement. And here I think what's interesting is that, as Emily indicated, we go from a position allegedly of great certainty, superficially you could say of great certainty by politicians such as David Davis, who before the referendum was confident about the benefits of leaving the EU, but in the reality of a post-referendum scenario, the kind of certainty that he once, in a sense, was articulating is very much different, because the understanding of the rules of the game of international trade seem not to have been fully grasped by him prior to the referendum. So we saw in May, in a what now, in a sense, the people who were interested in this became an infamous Twitter exchange, David Davis was suggesting that after a vote to leave the EU, the UK would be in a great position to do trade deals with different EU countries. He was suggesting things to do with agriculture, for instance, with Poland and France, and manufactured goods with Germany. The problem with that interpretation is that's a completely faulty, that is a complete misunderstanding then of how the EU works in international trade. It coordinates, it negotiates as a single body, as a single bloc. So you can't do trade deals with individual countries within the EU from the outside. That would be completely illegal under EU rules. So on that basis, David Davis is having, in this new position as Secretary of State for Brexit, to try and learn and understand the rules of the game for the kind of negotiation that he and others will be conducting, in a way that it seems he had very little idea of what those rules would actually consist of. Another aspect of this whole uncertainty is the question of the rules for actually leaving the EU and on what basis those rules can actually be invoked. So that in the UK context, we know that the Treaty of Lisbon says you can withdraw from the EU according to a procedure that is contained in Article 50 of that treaty, and that seems clear enough. However, there's a question mark in the British context about whether that is a decision to be taken by Parliament or whether it's a decision that is a prerogative of the Crown and therefore of the government of the day. There's actually a legal case that is working its way through the courts about challenging the idea, the principle, that the government alone, without consulting Parliament that is, can actually trigger Article 50. So there's a great deal of uncertainty about Article 50. The one thing we do know there is, apart from the fact that the lawyers in the government and the petitioners against the idea that the government alone can trigger it, we also know that Article 50 wasn't triggered immediately after the referendum, and again, that contradicts what David Cameron had suggested prior to the vote. Maybe he said that in bad faith, and he certainly doesn't seem to have had any plan to trigger it himself, so that might suggest bad faith on his part. But the fact that Theresa May still hasn't triggered it one way or the other, she has a parliamentary majority of course, suggests that the government itself wants to be in a better position in terms of understanding the rules about triggering the article and the kind of negotiating position it can actually work with to leave the EU. So there's lots of uncertainty in that context as well. And finally, as part of that, there are the questions about what steps need to be taken even before Brexit can happen. That's something perhaps you can elaborate on, Emily.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's, I suppose, one of the first things that people waking up on the 24th were wondering, if it wasn't going to be triggered on that day, what do we need to do to get between now and actually leaving the EU? And we've actually had several narratives come out, and I suppose what we're doing now is piecing together not only the legal, technical steps that need to be made, but also the political steps that different parties are making in order to perhaps contest or grow the legitimacy for this particular decision. So there's two different aspects that need to be borne in mind. This isn't just about sort of triggering a number of legal steps, pushing a number of buttons in the right order, which we currently don't know what order they should be pushed in. But it's also about different parties using the process as fodder for competition. And you can see it, for example, in the Labour leadership. Two different leader candidates saying different things about what ought to happen next, whether there ought to be a second referendum, how it ought to be carried out, and so forth. So the steps to Brexit are as much political as they are institutional and procedural.
That's a really essential takeaway comment there from Emily, and I think to emphasize that point, we can look at what is inevitably a complex legal process behind Brexit, but that it would be a misrepresentation to characterize that as something that is purely technical. That is, we can't just leave that to the lawyers, and the government doesn't intend just to leave that to its lawyers, just like the EU doesn't intend to leave it to its lawyers, because the actual legal process is intimately ideological and even normative, on the basis then that the politics of the different kinds of deals that can be struck or that need to be struck are absolutely huge in their political fallout. And we see that illustrated very nicely in something that gained quite a lot of traction, which is an article by the Centre for European Reform. The link is here at the bottom of this particular slide. And it's written by Charles Grant, who is talking about the way in which the Brexit negotiations that Theresa May is in charge of are not one negotiation, but rather have six interconnected components. And again, it sounds very technical, it sounds very precise and legal, but beneath that surface, there's a huge amount of political disagreement and a lot of political fallout depending on what happens according to each of these different, in a sense, issue areas. And what Charles Grant does in this really interesting piece is he divides them up between the first thing, which is the mechanics of the legal separation in terms of once Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty is triggered, what do you actually do about triggering that and then responding to the actual counter offers from the EU when it comes to the terms of a legal separation. And thereafter, you have the need for some kind of trade relationship with the EU, because that, remember, is about half the UK's exports and about half the UK's imports when it comes to international trade. So you can't just walk away from the EU without having some future agreement. But that is actually legally distinct from the process of legally leaving the EU. So you need to leave on the one hand, but negotiate what replaces the status quo, that is, the UK's membership of the EU. One idea for that is some kind of interim arrangement, a kind of halfway house with one foot inside, one foot outside the door, as it were. The problem with that interim arrangement is that you also need to think about what happens to international trade for the UK outside the EU. That's the other half of international trade for the country then. And that involves discussions about what you do to gain access to the World Trade Organization. The World Trade Organization, the UK currently participates in via its EU membership. Outside the EU, it would have to try and negotiate entry into the WTO on the basis of the other 160 odd members of the WTO actually choosing to agree to the terms of UK accession. And again, that sounds like it's just a question of technicalities, but the technicalities about what kind of tariff regulations you have, what is and isn't included in the WTO arrangement, is intensely political, because industries that are excluded, industries that are included in that arrangement will face a great number of repercussions, especially if they're excluded from it, for instance. On top of that, we also know that walking away from the EU means walking away from the 53 trade deals that the EU currently has with other non-EU countries. So once those have gone, once the UK has walked away from the EU, it also walks away from those. So therefore, on top of the WTO accession, it needs to start thinking about free trade deals with non-EU countries. Complication with that is, countries outside the EU will not be able to actually finalize any new treaty on the basis of free trade with the UK until the UK clarifies its position vis-à-vis the rest of the EU. So there's a catch-22 situation where the UK needs to negotiate with countries outside the EU, but can't do so until it's actually got either an interim or a permanent agreement about how, on what terms it leaves the EU, at least when it comes to trade. Finally, the EU does a lot more than just trade, and as a result, there might have to be separate negotiations, separate institutionalized practices or forms of cooperation about foreign, defense, and security policy. Is there anything I've missed in all of that, Emily?
No, what I think is interesting though is that here we have 6 distinct but interrelated issues. And so there's the question of how they'll be carried out, but there's also, and this is something that's always interested me, is the order in which these things have to go. And there's a sort of order that's institutional, you know, if you have to have legal separation, interim cover, and then perhaps negotiate other agreements. But then the fact is that politics is messy, and these things tend to have a timeline of their own as well. So it'll be interesting to see actually how these things overlap, how they force each other into a pattern, into a particular process or a particular set of decisions. So it'll be really, really interesting to see how that goes on.
And I might also add here, it's also going to be interesting about who personally within government is going to be in charge of the different aspects of this interrelated 6-fold negotiation. Theresa May is in charge of a very small committee that includes then Boris Johnson, Liam Fox, as well as David Davis. But on the ground, the civil servants and the different cabinet ministers who actually cover these different areas, trade, defense, foreign policy, etc., are going to have a lot of groundwork to cover and a lot of coordination to actually, and a lot of issues to do with arising from that coordination to resolve. So this will be a real challenge for leadership within government that includes both the political side of things but also the civil servant side of things. And in terms of having a capacity to do so, the UK is at a disadvantage because trade negotiations since the UK joined the EEC in 1973 have been conducted by Brussels-based bureaucrats, some of whom actually are British but who work now for the EU. So the question of the capacity to negotiate, the capacity of government to achieve what it wants in these different areas when it knows what it wants exactly is open to question as well. And that brings us then to what will be at the forefront of the government ministers and the Prime Minister's mind, which is when negotiating all these different aspects of EU withdrawal, what are the long-term economic repercussions from decisions taken about the mechanics, about the actual details of EU withdrawal? So Emily, do you want to take us through some of these challenges?
Absolutely. So what I find particularly interesting is that these long-term economic challenges tend to be discussed at different levels. So the fact is that we are a unitary state, so Brexit currently is supposed to affect the entire UK, but at the same time we're seeing different regions fearing different repercussions or threatening different modes of reaction to Brexit, whether that's new independence referendums or asking for a greater devolution and so forth. So we have these generic challenges that will have to be addressed, and these include, you know, how will we trade with others? What will be the rules and the basis on which we will trade with others? but also things like shared burdens. Like currently, we get assistance and we are part of a bigger playing field. We have people who come to support us to deal with boundary spanning problems that don't stop at our borders. And that's the case, for example, with money laundering or with, for example, big corporations that perhaps don't play fair. How are we as a single player going to address these boundary spanning and relatively considerable challenges? Closer to home, of course, businesses will be fearing, and this is something that will affect small and medium-sized businesses as well as the big ones. And how will Brexit impact on confidence, investors' confidence, which ultimately is one of the key variables in how much money gets invested in the UK? What impact will it have on the prices that we pay at the supermarket for our food or on wages, for example? And finally, this broader question of migration, and especially labour migration. What will be the new rules of the game for people coming from within the EU, from out with the EU, from the Commonwealth? Who will be allowed in? What will they be allowed to do? Who will be working in our hospitals? Who will be teaching us at university? All of these questions are playing out at different levels, at the UK level, at the national level, and sometimes at the local level as well.
And here I would like to reinforce the point about confidence. If we think about the government's position, which is to act on the referendum vote and to see it through, it will also try then and fundamentally seek, whilst doing so, to reassure international companies, international finance, that the UK is in a strong position to actually grow and to deliver on various forms of prosperity. But at the same time, I think the confidence that Theresa May also wishes to achieve is the confidence of the electorate that not only was this the right decision and one that was taken democratically, but also that it's being carried out successfully in the right way. But those things might actually be in tension with each other, because the confidence of the electorate is very different perhaps from the confidence of big businesses. So whereas big businesses might think it's absolutely imperative to have free movement of labour within the EU single market in order to benefit from a bigger pool of qualified labour, the majority electorate might have a completely different reading of what it takes to remain confident about negotiating Brexit successfully. And I think that will be a key challenge. The immigration aspect will be a key challenge. But I also like the fact that if we focus down on a particular example, there you have the question about a place such as Wales, which had a majority in favour of leaving the EU. What is actually the future of a nation there, a constituent part of the UK, that actually has a net economic gain when it comes to funds redistributed by the EU to Wales, which doesn't have a huge surplus of funding via devolution in the UK system that is known as the Barnett formula. What kind of opportunities or challenges does Wales, for instance, which has that majority mandate for leaving the EU, face? Emily, you're going to be relocating to Wales soon, so this one is over for you.
So I leave for Wales tomorrow morning, and what I found particularly interesting when I went down to the first flat was that at every roundabout there's a massive infrastructure project being undertaken in Swansea, and every single one of them has a big panel that says funded by the EU, and yet Swansea's opted to leave. So that was a puzzle, and I had a look at Wales. And Wales is a very interesting part of the UK because it enjoys a net benefit from the EU. It's one of the regions that actually enjoys the most investment from the EU. And at the same time, tends to be, or is at least perceived to be, but it tends to play out correctly actually, it tends to be underfunded per capita as a result of the formula that we use to allocate money to the different devolved administrations. So on the one hand, it seems to be losing its primary source of income. On the other hand, it doesn't have anything in place currently that will normally serve to match the funding it is about to lose. So I thought, well, is this the case of turkeys voting for Christmas? What's the logic behind it? And actually what I've seen, and this is true in Wales, and I think it's playing out at the rest of the UK as well, is we've now entered a second phase narrative about Brexit. We woke up the next day and the markets were unhappy, and we saw a massive reduction in the value of the pound and the value of investments in the UK. And then actually we've entered a second phase where so far the apocalypse has not happened, markets are bouncing back, and now politicians are having the opportunity to recast this and Brexit and the future as really a chance to do new politics. And that's happening in Wales. So for example, today we have Carwyn Jones saying we are going to need to sell Wales like never before, and we are going to make the very best of Brexit for Wales. So what people are saying is that this is now the cards that have been dealt. The idea is to make the best out of it. How is it going to be possible for Wales and Welsh politicians to get the best case out of this? And in fact, being underfunded or losing funding may be exactly what they need to turn around to Westminster and to UK politicians and say, listen, the current settlement that we have was ineffective, we're unhappy with it, we would like to renegotiate, we would like to find a new way of doing politics in Wales. So it may actually be an opportunity for new Welsh politics.
So those are some really thought-provoking comments there, Emily, thanks. And I think what that illustrates is the way that Brexit has made, and if you're thinking about these narratives of politics, we would say, I think, that Brexit has made UK politics very much future-oriented, rather than about recriminations about the past and how we tell stories about different holy cows within British politics and policies. It's very much now a focus on the future and how we get to that future on the basis of Brexit. Or even how, if you're Owen Smith, for instance, the candidate for challenging for the leadership of the Labour Party, how we actually stop Brexit from happening, which is something we can talk about later. But if you think as well about that future-oriented dimension then within British politics, I think that also relates very much to the fact that this whole uncertainty created by Brexit is also means a rethinking of the kind of system of representation and the politics between the constituent parts of the UK, and not just places which have devolved administrations, Northern Ireland, Wales and Scotland, but also parts of England itself, how they face up to or are represented within Westminster or vis-a-vis Westminster. So there are lots of really interesting developments, I think, on that front. And I think the root cause of that is the fact that we see quite clearly from the cold numbers that we've got a very disparate vote on the basis of the result of the 23rd of June. We've got a divided country where you have a 62% majority in Scotland wanting to stay with the status quo, which is just a bit above what the preference in London was. And then we have areas that actually have a very high foreign-born population being strongly in favour of Remain. So those more mixed areas, if we call them that, having a strong Remain component compared with areas that might perhaps be thought to have a real economic incentive to vote in favour of sticking with the EU arrangement, places like East Yorkshire, Lancashire as well, Lincolnshire, that actually had a very strong Leave vote. And so on that basis we see that these divides can also be, or if we drill down a bit further, linked to different demographic and socio-economic factors. Emily, do you want to jump in with those?
I do, and here I want to point out also, I put a link to a better map that shows Northern Ireland a bit better, because the map we have at the beginning has a problem that it's yellow, and it seems to show that Northern Ireland is all voting Remain. But what's most interesting when you look at Northern Ireland and you compare that map to, for example, Scotland during the independence referendum, is that you see borders play a big part in determining how people vote. So people who are closer to the Republic of Ireland were more likely to vote to Remain. Similarly, in Scotland, when we had our independence referendum, the borderlands of Scotland voted to remain within the UK more strongly than other areas as well. So borders is another interesting variable, because here you must be thinking about identity. You have a more permeable identity. Perhaps you have friends or families or neighbours who live on the other side of the border, and that's playing into it as well. So we have a very divided nation, but within each unit, of course, there's a great deal of variable. You know, so in Scotland, 62% voted to Remain. Here in Stirling, where the university is, it was up to 65%, but it also means that 35% of people here are voting to leave.
Thanks, Emily. I think one of the things that really comes out as well from the initial attempt to drill down into the data about the referendum result is this statistic to do with levels of education as a key predictor of how individuals would vote. So that people with university degrees had a vastly higher majority preference for staying in the EU than those without. And perhaps it's not a surprise then that London, which has a very high percentage of people with degrees, therefore has overall a 60% vote for Remain. And the parts of the UK that have lower levels of educational achievement are the areas, for instance, on the East Coast, also in the various other coastal parts, that actually have then the very high levels of support for Leave. And we'll talk more about how that maps onto actual parliamentary constituencies in a second, but it's important still to bear in mind that we've had a referendum that is based then on direct democracy, one person, one vote on the EU issue, but the House of Commons, the British Parliament then, is still very much at the centre of the whole Brexit scenario. And there are a number of scenarios here that we can envisage in which Parliament is going to play a crucial role. And so one question is, what might a majority of pro-EU members of Parliament do when it comes to actually putting through the legislation that not just will trigger Brexit, but actually will confirm it, that is, with some kind of new deal to replace the existing status quo, that is, membership of the European Union? Because the statistics are pretty clear that you have a vast majority of MPs elected in 2015 in favour of staying in the EU. The self-declared Brexiteers, if you will, who were in the House of Commons number around 140. That leaves more than 400 in favour of staying in the EU. And Theresa May has a government with a majority of 12. As a result, getting Parliament to vote to trigger Article 50 or getting Parliament to agree to new terms of access and participation in the single market isn't a given if you've got so many MPs in favour of staying in the EU. The other complication to note here, of course, is that since 2010 we have a Fixed Parliaments Act, which means that you will have to have an election only in 2020, that is a 5-year term of office for the current government, unless there's a 2/3 majority in the House of Parliament and the House of Commons to overturn that act. That's a very high threshold, so that means that small majority for the Conservative Party can endure until 2020, but we're not certain at all how that majority would actually work in the context of having to vote on triggering Brexit or on sealing the deal for Brexit. And one really interesting, in a sense, analytical point here is raised by Chris Hanratty in some of the data that he's produced since the referendum. Emily, do you want to talk about that?
So this is an interesting one because we often use constituencies as our level or unit of analysis when we discuss votes. So we compare how one constituency voted against another, and we usually do that over time as well, so we can watch how one constituency evolved in its particular vote. Actually, the referendum results were counted according to local authority areas, which means that it's very difficult to tell how people in one constituency voted because they don't overlap perfectly. Yet the people representing us in Parliament, in the House of Commons, represent a constituency. So it may actually be very difficult for them if they live in a particularly divided demographic area to know exactly how the people they represent voted in this referendum. That's going to matter when it comes, and if it comes, to voting in any legislation on Brexit. Now, even that is a matter of uncertainty. Today we find out that part of the government is not keen on having Brexit legislation passed through the House of Commons at all, in the sense that they would rather it be a sort of executive decree. There may not be a need for Parliament to vote on it at all. But if it does, is there a legitimacy for MPs to vote in a way that perhaps their area didn't vote?
And I thoroughly recommend this succinct and extremely analytically precise and well-argued piece by Chris Hanratty, because the striking thing there, to reinforce what Emily is saying, is that it might not be a surprise to know that for Conservative MPs, he estimates that 75% of Conservative constituencies, that is constituencies with a sitting Conservative Member of Parliament, vote had a majority to leave the EU. But when it comes to Labour, that number is actually 70%, and not so different. Those constituencies that returned a Labour MP are not so different when it comes to the preference for leaving the EU as Conservative constituencies. And that's why it's no surprise then that there is a leadership contest in the Labour Party that reflects as well the divisions over how to talk about immigration, about how to talk about trade, globalization, neoliberalism within an EU context that divides then Jeremy Corbyn and his supporters from Owen Smith. Now let's turn to some questions that we collated via the MOOC website then since the Brexit vote. Do you want to take us through the first one, Andy?
Sure, absolutely. So I was having a look at the different forums set up after the vote and conversations that continued after the vote on existing forums. So a lot of focus was actually on the impact and the consequences of this referendum on certain parties, for example. And of course, there was this idea that UKIP, which always puts forward a relatively full manifesto, but ultimately tends to be known for one or two of its particular policies. What's going to happen to UKIP now that it has had its main manifesto pledge fulfilled? And this is actually a question that we had put to one of our guests, David Coburn, the leader of UKIP in Scotland, when he came and talked on a panel that we held a few months ago. And I asked him what will happen the day after. And ultimately, it's up to them now to find a meaning for themselves in this post-referendum vote.
And then I would add that the success of UKIP in getting the referendum on the agenda and then also on delivering a vote, helping to deliver a vote to leave, was based on direct democracy. But as we've been talking about, the negotiations with the EU about enacting Brexit are based on government and parliament, and UKIP only has one MP. So its ability to influence the debate over the negotiations is going to be very limited unless it's very well organized as a grassroots political party that is able, in a sense, to help control, shift, and shape the agenda of the Brexit negotiations. But as a grassroots political party, we do know that the organizational, institutional solidity of UKIP is open to question, and it is facing a rather messy leadership context at the moment, and without a figurehead with the charisma, the straight talking, if you will, of Nigel Farage, who resigned immediately after the referendum, it will be very difficult for them to put their stamp on Brexit. And as a result, again, that gives a lot of leeway, perhaps, you might think, to the government, but the government also needs to start thinking about legitimacy and what it thinks the electorate wants. But if really one of the big voices for the electorate who want to leave the UK isn't represented in Parliament, that might mean that that kind of voice isn't actually getting heard as well. So there could be some real issues of legitimacy further down the line. And those issues of legitimacy, when it comes to how do we represent our electorate, are really absolutely at the heart of post-Brexit Labour. Do you want to expand on that then as well?
Absolutely. So Labour have had a difficult time with this particular referendum. They had a hard time, for example, finding a way to appeal to its core electorate, and that's represented in the breakdown of votes. You're right, the constituencies that returned a Labour MP, for example, still have a large number of people who voted to leave. So in that sense, there is a troubling time ahead, and a lot of housekeeping is currently being done. It's being done in a particularly conflictual manner with two different people who represent two very different visions of the Labour Party. So this is a particular quote that I liked, actually, as part of a blog post by John Redwood about what it is that Labour has failed to do so far, perhaps, and what it ought to do next. So it's quite a long quote, and you can read the whole article with the link at the bottom, but I'll read it out for the benefit of those listening. Both sides in the leadership debate would prefer continued membership of the EU, despite many Labour voters and a large majority of all voters in heavily Labour areas agreeing with a national verdict to leave. Neither side has a positive view of what to do about unlimited immigration. Neither side dares mention the word England, sticking to their outdated, lopsided devolution for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, without nothing for the largest country of the Union. Neither has a good idea on how to win back votes from the SNP in Scotland, nor how to stop more votes for Conservatives and UKIP in England. And I thought that was particularly interesting because this is lifeline stuff. This is how the party will continue to exist if it continues to exist. And it's true that this has been a watershed moment for the party as it tries to find a new identity for itself in 2016.
And I think we can go back here to the point that underlies a lot of this referendum, post-referendum turmoil, which is about representation. Who does Labour actually represent? Does it represent the people who are satisfied with the status quo, who are generally tend to be in London and also in Scotland, except that Scottish Labour has been wiped out? So trying to get a basis in England and Wales, where it faces much stiffer competition now from UKIP, is a real challenge unless you start re-evaluating your position vis-a-vis the European Union. And yet that's not what its metropolitan core in the parliamentary party, but also in terms of its membership, wants. So that's a real bind that it's placed in. And it's interesting that Redwood here makes the comparison with Scotland, because the Scottish, in a sense, debacle crept up gradually on the Labour Party. It, in a sense, had the wool pulled from under its feet gradually. But here with the EU referendum, it's happened much more suddenly, and there isn't much time with the prospect of the Article 50 being triggered and a new general election having to come, obviously, in 2020 to get into shape to actually be both a credible opposition until 2020 and perhaps be in a position to mount a successful challenge to win that general election in 2020. So there's really very high stakes game played for the Labour Party, and all of that, of course, strengthens the position of the Conservative government when it comes to actually seeing through Brexit and winning the next general election, although here again there are certain question marks. And I think the big question mark is actually raised by one of the comments that came from the debates that have been conducted on the MOOC platform since the referendum, which is this comment by DC then about how we can really contemplate the UK taking this momentous step, that is Brexit, on the basis of a very slim majority, 72% turnout, which actually is the highest since the general election of 1992, so actually a strong turnout by contemporary standards, and also coming in a sense at the expense of disenfranchisement of a large majority of young voters, who will be the ones, as DC rightly points out, to experience the full consequences of Brexit in the future. So Emily, what's your take on this thought-provoking question?
So I remember turning the radio on after the referendum, and for about 2 weeks, most of what the BBC was playing were debates between callers. Usually a young person and an older person were pitted against each other. So the young person was supposed to be telling the old person off for voting against their future, and the old person saying that their vote was worth as much. One person, one vote. It's direct democracy. And I remember getting a bit tired of all of this. Because it was, at this stage, still phase one in the narrative. It was about trying to understand what had just happened rather than build a future-looking discussion. So what's always interesting about this is that these discussions always emerge. They emerge no matter what the turnout is. They emerge no matter what the franchise is. We extend franchise. In Scotland, we've extended it, for example, to 16 and 17-year-olds who can now vote. And maybe in 10 years' time, we'll be discussing extending it to other groups. Here, we had a UK election franchise, which means that, for example, EU migrants living here could not participate. Young people, 16 and 17-year-olds, couldn't participate either. But these are the rules that we've chosen, and we must benchmark the decision on those. So afterwards, it's about a societal discussion about who ought to be voting in this, who we would like to see voting in this. And that's not a case-by-case discussion to be having.
The other thing one could add here is on the question of, well, who are the interested parties or most interested parties when it comes to this vote and its repercussions? Emily's already mentioned EU citizens living in the UK, but also we mustn't forget about UK citizens living outside the UK, that is in other EU countries, of whom there are certainly at least 1 million, possibly 2, depending on the estimates that you go with, and they perhaps have the most at stake when it comes to thinking about a new post-Brexit arrangement when it comes to their pensions, when it comes to access to healthcare, access to residency rights, etc., that were taken for granted whilst the UK was a member of the EU, that can no longer be taken for granted once the UK has withdrawn, depending obviously on the terms of that withdrawal. And this, I think, takes to the point again about political representation, that is about who's getting represented even in a referendum. British expats were for the most part then disenfranchised, or unable, that is, to express their preferences, and maybe that's a reason why actually you have such a result in the first instance. However, everyone might say that they are an interested party in all of this, and choices eventually are made about the franchise and about how it is going to work. So I think Emily's point is about the conversation and the kind of arrangements, which is the government's, I think, underlying headache about making Brexit work, whatever Brexit actually means, to generate a consensus about the terms of that EU withdrawal. And what's interesting is that this links very much to the second question about rerunning the referendum, which is, well, how do you generate consensus for leaving the EU on the basis that voters voted to leave the EU, but without knowing what the terms of withdrawal actually consist of? And perhaps it is only legitimate then to have another form of popular expression, whether it's a general election or, as Owen Smith says, a second referendum, is open to question. But I think there will be, eventually, depending on the terms of that Brexit deal, momentum to actually have some kind of popular conversation, some form of popular consent given to the actual arrangement for leaving the EU and finalising the details thereof. Again, the government is in a relatively strong position given the disarray amongst the opposition, but it has a very small majority in Parliament. Those MPs might be rather nervous about taking a decision that could see them getting wiped out if their constituency voters disapprove of that decision. And it doesn't take so much of a swing away from, say, Conservative MPs to indicate that they might be nervous about voting consistently with the government position on that basis. And then there's also the question of these national divides, a question that I think you're better qualified to talk about, Emily.
So this is interesting as well. You know, we're talking about a unitary state voting. So in that sense, the Scottish constituency is counted the same way as the Welsh constituency or Northern Irish constituency. But what we can clearly see is that there were regional differences for a number of reasons. And we've discussed identity and voting identity and demographic variables in previous discussions. So here we have to question legitimacy when it comes to lopsided votes. And of course there's a discussion in Scotland where the entire map is yellow, as you can see, and every single local authority area came back with a positive vote for remaining in the EU, yet at the same time will now be part of the unitary state that will be going down the path of Brexit. So of course we've been having a conversation up north about how that might happen, whether that might happen, whether it ought to happen, and how people in Scotland can get the best deal out of it.
And that takes us nicely onto a final slide that actually talks about the potential breakup of the United Kingdom, which is again something that is a repercussion, at least in theory, but we'll see that there's a lot of practical discourse on that very basis that has emerged immediately after the referendum result was announced. And again, this is the question as well, that do the politicians negotiating Brexit think there will be a consensus to leave the EU at the cost of major constitutional changes, transformations, to truncating even the UK? That's something that I think remains open to question, because it's clear that a number of leading politicians, these are not in a sense obscure or minor interventions, but in Scotland and Northern Ireland there are major concerns and people of real weight and significance. The First Minister in Scotland, that is Nicola Sturgeon, who immediately, our response to the Brexit vote was to say that there is a need to make sure Scotland's voice is heard and our wishes respected. And since those wishes were about remaining in the EU by what would be considered a pretty healthy majority in any referendum on an EU or other matters, that's quite a mandate. And she is interpreting that as a mandate to try and keep Scotland connected to the EU on a number of different issues, including free movement of people, for instance, that clearly then puts it at odds with what you imagine the people designing Brexit in the Foreign Office under Boris Johnson or in the Secretary of State for Brexit under David Davis are thinking themselves. And here there are some interesting options, including two then, one that's more obvious than the other, which would be to hold a second independence referendum if Brexit actually goes ahead, Article 50 is triggered, to then actually have a new mandate based on material changes in Scotland's position in the UK and globally, and see whether that leads to independence, on the basis that independence would also be associated with an appeal to actually accede to join, that is, the European Union. The more funky possibility is the legal, in a sense, construction, a fabrication that it can be called a reverse Greenland situation, whereby the rest of the United Kingdom, England and Wales, that voted to leave the EU, could leave the EU, but Scotland and Northern Ireland perhaps could stay in. That's pregnant with legal complications, but also politically that's very difficult on the basis as well that Scotland and Northern Ireland are not states under international law and haven't been party to any of the treaties that the UK has made with the EU, and also with non-EU countries that have treaties with the EU. So the possibilities in practice of that, although I do recommend thoroughly this blog that talks about this potential option, the possibilities in practice are much lower than for a second independence referendum, which technically the Scottish Government could organise even without the consent of Westminster, but which wouldn't necessarily have to be respected then by Westminster. And then we also have finally, if you want to finish on this, Northern Ireland, the case of Northern Ireland.
So this is an interesting one, and that's why I sort of left it until the end, because it's not the case of Scotland. It is a divided area. That entire nation did not vote in bloc to remain. Again, I mentioned that the differences in particular with regards to borders with the Republic of Ireland. And again here we see two phases in the narrative. Immediately after the vote, there's this idea of holding another referendum, not necessarily on independence, but a border poll to see what the future ought to hold. There's this discussion about how exactly, considering Northern Ireland is the only nation in the UK to have a physical border with an EU country, how that border is going to change. And of course that is very pregnant with issues of history and hard borders between the north and the south of that particular island. So of course that's going to be very difficult and very delicate to disentangle. But I think more broadly there's a question about whether or not EU referendum votes, whether that was in Scotland, Northern Ireland or Yorkshire, can be equated to any other type of political support. So in Scotland, was it possible that you voted to remain in the EU, but you would still rather be part of the UK if the second independence vote came up? Just because the UK is leaving the EU doesn't mean necessarily there will be an overwhelming 62% majority in the next independence referendum in Scotland. Similarly, is it possible for us to equate a vote to remain in the EU with a vote to support reunification between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland? And that's highly questionable.
And this is where trying to interpret the referendum in the context of the question mark that hangs over the future of the United Kingdom as a country is particularly difficult to do, because preferences, voter preferences, are not transitive by any means. So that one can have a preference to be outside of the EU, but that doesn't mean in a Northern Irish case that the preference is to then have Northern Ireland be attached to the rest of Ireland. Similarly, for Scotland and the future of Scotland within the British Union. And the thing to add there is that's a problem at the domestic level within the UK when it comes to the constituent part. That's also a major headache when it comes to understanding what does the vote for Brexit actually mean in the event that what the UK government actually negotiates with the EU is an EU-light arrangement. Something like, for instance, the European Economic Area, where you keep the four fundamental freedoms, that is free movement of capital, free movement of goods, services, and also people. You simply do away with the rights and obligations of membership on top of that. Now that's an arrangement that might satisfy a lot of businesses it might satisfy a lot of individuals, including a lot of expats, but people who want to take back control and who really mean that would have a great problem with having Parliament, which is supposed to be sovereign or more sovereign in the context of leaving the EU, and implement EU rules, having to accept free movement, etc., etc., and no longer having a say within the EU institutions. Can the government get away with packaging that as the best deal for the UK and have the legitimacy to actually put that into practice? That's a major headache for then interpreting what this vote actually means. And in that context, I think that Theresa May, to finish off, was being more than a little disingenuous to suggest that Brexit means Brexit. I think she herself, and the reason she hasn't triggered Article 50 is precisely because of this. She knows that it's actually very complicated to disentangle what Brexit actually might mean through the legal technicalities, but also about what the political possibilities are, about what the Parliament in Westminster at the regional level within the UK, and also what the public as a whole actually would find to be an adequate, suitable settlement for Brexit. So in that sense, the stakes are very high, and there's still a great deal of uncertainty, at least in my head, even after an hour of talking about this, prompted by your great questions and also by Emily's great interventions. So I think we'll leave it at that. So I'm going to sign off. Emily?
Yeah, I'm sorry if we've raised more questions than answered. Hopefully you can get back in touch with us at some point on Twitter. We'll keep the Twitter account going if you have any other questions or if you're ever interested in anything else. And talk to you soon. Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye, everyone.